greetings everybody, and welcome to my continued series on Canadian history. This period, which covers roughly 15 years, is such a dynamic period that we're going to break it up into two. So there will be a Laurier era part 1 and part 2, just so that we can really get into some of the incredible dynamic things that were going on in this country. Now keep in mind, not only did Canada welcome hundreds of thousands of people, new immigrants to the country, but in addition to that, we had begun to make not only tremendous advancements in technology, but we had also really begun to understand the incredible opportunities there were for resources from this country. So really a very, very dynamic period of history. Sir Wilfrid Laurier, over here, was Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister, was very much a pragmatist, very charismatic, very well liked by both English and French-Canadian politicians, so he was really kind of very, very well placed. And the timing, of course, is important. Why did this happen now? Well, the wounds of the execution of Louis Riel were still relatively fresh, and you know, this sort of French and English conflict that really began way back in the period following the American Revolution when the Loyalists came up to Canada. There's always been this delicate balancing act between English interests and French-Canadian interests, and that kind of struggle would continue and continues throughout Canada's history. So anyway, let's move on, and actually let's maybe talk a bit about the pictures. This is a picture of a boat called the Komagatu Maru. We'll talk about what happened there. This is a group of women's, a group of suffragettes rather, looking to get the vote. And this is the kind of poster that the Canadian government would send overseas to entice people to come to Canada. So why was Canada interested in having all these people come? Well, we had a huge amount of space, and we had populations dispersed in very specific areas. And once Canada became a coast-to-coast nation, the goal was to fill that prairie area with farmers so that we could get access to all those incredible resources which we would be able to grow, particularly wheat, of course, too. So, all right, let's move on. So with the inclusion of Saskatchewan and Alberta as Canada's 8th and 9th provinces in 1905, Canada was now a sea-to-sea nation. For quite a number of years, roughly 35, Canada stopped at Manitoba, what is now Manitoba, and in the middle of that was all fur trading territory, and was once owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, known as Rupert's Land. It was later sold to Canada in 1870, just after Confederation, I believe. And British Columbia, now on the Pacific coast, had become part of Canada. So you have this huge landscape in between BC and Manitoba that, while was part of Canada, had not been broken up into provinces yet. So there was a real push to make that happen, which happens in 1905. Canada still feared a takeover by the US and struggled for greater independence from Britain, especially in foreign affairs. That's kind of the tug and pull that Canada had dealt with since the British North America Act of 1867. 1867 was the year that Canada became its own nation, an autonomous dominion. We were still connected to Great Britain because they still controlled our foreign policy, but we were free to elect our own leaders and manage our own domestic policy as well. So, you know, pretty well, very close to complete autonomy, but that comes a little later in 1931 with something called the Statute of Westminster, and we'll talk about that in another lecture. So, Canada's place in the British Empire also raised questions about loyalty from both French and English Canadians. Now, as I said earlier, the complex and troubled relationship between English Canadians and French Canadians goes way, way, way back. And I would strongly recommend that if by the time you watch this, if I've posted those lectures, it's almost, I always say it's advantageous to kind of start at the beginning and work your way up. And the lectures on YouTube are not necessarily going to be in order, because I'm prioritizing lectures that I'm using for my classes, for my students right now. But at some point I'll have them all, all backlogged and all added to my site. And because I really think, in order to understand that complex dynamic between the English and the French, you have to go back to that period after the American Revolution, even a bit before, when you look at the Plains of Abraham in 1759, because for our purposes we don't really have time to get into that, but please, I do strongly suggest you look into that if you haven't already done so. My point here is that because of Canada's close connection and association with Great Britain, that descendants of the Loyalists were the people who fled the American Revolution, who remained loyal to the King. Because there was such a rich sort of British tradition in this country and influence, French Canadians were always kind of a little bit perplexed as to how do we identify with a British monarch. We're not British, and even though we are part of the empire, French Canadians were always trying to find their place within this empire, if you will. It was in this climate in 1896 when Canada elected its first French-Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and he had inherited a nation poised for tremendous growth, gold in the Yukon, thousands of immigrants to the west, and a huge leap in technological innovations like airplanes, the telephone, radios, automobiles, motion pictures would change island communities. When you think about life before the radio, life before the photograph, life before communications of any kind, what you saw exist in North America, now this could be, the same could be said for the United States and for Canada, and probably all around the world. The idea that if you lived in a small town in the middle of the prairies, for example, your small town was your world. You read about the outside world, you maybe have seen pictures about the outside world, you certainly had heard about it, but it was over there. So if you grew up in the middle of Saskatchewan, you knew about Vancouver and Toronto and New York and Montreal and other places, but they were so far away. The thought of even going there was just inconceivable. So really, your world was your town, your post office, your corner grocer, your community church, your school, and your local hospital. And most people who were born in these small island communities would be born, raised, and would die in these communities. I almost kind of look at these island communities through rose-colored glasses, because it's easy to idealize a time when people were not so distracted by technology or are not so overwhelmed by technology, that times are much more innocent, much more wholesome, I guess, what might almost be a cliche. I can't help but think about the show Little House on the Prairie, which is sort of the epitome of that sort of small town island community mentality. But what this technology does is it begins to connect these small communities with a greater nation, Canada. So now people could watch films in theaters, they could drive somewhere in a car, they could even fly somewhere later. These isolated communities are now being connected to other communities. Growth increased tension, and women, First Nations, workers, and new immigrants would begin to seek greater rights in Canada. The reason these groups and others were seeking rights is because in many cases they were so sort of blatantly discriminated against. I mean, when we look back at our past and we look at our treatment of Chinese Canadians, who were instrumental, by the way, in building the railway, we look back at our treatment of First Nations, our attitudes towards women before they get the vote, and so on and so forth, that it makes one realize how far we have come along, because what was commonly understood as the norm 100 years ago, today we would find simply shocking. And what you see emerge out of this new connectedness of communities and people beginning to understand what's happening in other parts of the country more clearly, people began to question their own place. Well, maybe I should be entitled to work here. Maybe I should be entitled to vote. or go to university or get off the reserve and do something else or whatever it may be. So there is a growing tension with this technology. As a French Canadian, Laurier was well aware of the complex dynamic he had to confront in English and French differences, and the execution of Louis Riel 10 years before was still smoldering in the hearts of many French Canadians. And some of you might recognize this. Certainly if you're Canadian, you might go, haha, now you can tell your parents, hey mom and dad, I know who this is now. He's Canada's first French Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier. It's funny how we look at bills and we take it for granted. And now you guys can all look at that and tell your parents who this guy is. Being the first French Canadian Prime Minister made him very, very unique because he had to be sure that he would fit in with the predominantly English political culture of the time, but not be a yes man to English interests. He needed to reassure the French Canadians that he was going to work for the betterment of all Canadians, especially French Canadians, and try to elevate their status and place within a greater Canada. So he did have a balancing act because he didn't want to be seen as being too pro-English or too pro-French or whatever it may be. And a very, very complex position for a French Canadian Prime Minister to be in. But I think in hindsight he dealt with it very, very well. National unity was central to his goals in addition to protecting Canada's goals abroad. So, you know, the other thing you have to consider, that before we get hundreds of thousands, millions I believe, I'd have to look at the exact figure, for some reason 2 million seems to jog my memory, but you have to consider that once we get these hundreds of thousands, if not millions of immigrants to Canada, it is no longer just the First Peoples, the French, and the British. All of a sudden, you have this incredibly complex dynamic of people from Czechoslovakia, people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Russia, from Germany, from Great Britain, and so on and so forth. So the multicultural fabric of Canada really expands dramatically by the early 20th century as we introduce free land to many people from Eastern Europe. So it's very interesting. It was a conflict over language rights in Manitoba when the provincial government created an English-only school system in violation of the Manitoba Act, which pushed Laurier into power. Okay, you might recall if you watch my lecture dealing with Louis Riel and the Métis and the Red River and Northwest Rebellions, that Louis Riel was the key figure in getting Manitoba into confederation with Canada. Because of course 1867 was the birth of Canada with 4 provinces at the time, Upper and Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, but there were other British colonies and other areas that would slowly connect to this greater nation. And when Louis Riel negotiated Manitoba entering Confederation, one of the things that he was able to do was to ensure that both French and English speaking schools will get equal rights in Manitoba. But here we are only 20 years later after the Manitoba Act, give or take a few years, where the provincial government at that time decided to do away with the expectation that they have this balance and make it predominantly an English-speaking province. So French Canadians in Quebec, of course, were very, very upset about this, and certainly French Canadians that were living in Manitoba and those who had traveled to Manitoba to find work and raise families have now had the rug pulled out from under them, because then they can no longer put their children in French-speaking schools. So it was a very, very contentious issue. When Macdonald refused to intervene on behalf of French Canadians in Manitoba, Quebec voters turned to Laurier and the Liberal Party. Now, it's not so much that, you have to consider that Quebec and Ontario were the 2 most populous provinces in Canada at this time. And if you can get a vast majority of French Canadians from Quebec voting for Laurier, that's really going to tip the balance. I mean, there were a lot of even Liberals in Ontario who liked Laurier too, right? So, but I think it was that this overwhelming vote that Laurier would receive from the French Canadians that really tipped things over. So, so a real shift. And MacDonald, you know, Johnny MacDonald, as you may have seen and learned throughout the course of these lectures, has had a very complex and very troublesome history with Canada. He did a lot of really great things. He was instrumental to Confederation and building this nation and the CPR and everything else. But he also had a really ugly track record when it came to his treatment of Indigenous peoples, First Nations as we call them in Canada now, and his attitudes towards the Métis people. Métis people were mixed race, usually French, Canadian, and Aboriginal peoples. So there's a really difficult relationship and a difficult history there. So, you know, the jury's still out with Johnny MacDonald in terms of where he stands for many in Canada. So Laurier had kind of the difficult task of uniting both French and English Canadians behind the British Empire and the goals of imperialism, because French Canadians did not look to Britain as the seat of their culture. Now, it wasn't so much that the French Canadians were anti-British, but when they were exposed to all the Union Jacks, all this talk about being part of the Empire and the Queen and so on and so on and so forth, it isn't surprising that French Canadians would be a little bit perplexed as to how do they respond to this. They didn't necessarily want to come out screaming anti-British rhetoric, but they didn't want to be out there waving Union Jack flags either. So it was a very delicate thing. And once again, Laurier, as a French Canadian himself, had to somehow try to find that balance, right? So, since Confederation, Canada did not see a need to develop an army or navy, since Great Britain retained control of those areas as protectors of the country. Halifax and Esquimalt. Esquimalt, of course, is on Vancouver Island, just next to Victoria, were the hubs of Britain's Navy and Army. Okay, so, you know, one of the things in the British North America Act of 1867, when we became a nation in its first stage of nationhood, the cornerstone of that was that we would be independent, we would be able to elect our own leaders, but that Great Britain would control our foreign policy. And I think for most in Canada at the time, it was kind of reassuring to know that Big Brother or Big Sister is kind of going to look out for us if we get in any trouble. But it does get to a point where Canada begins to say, you know what, I think it's time we control our own armed forces. But so many Canadians viewed military responsibility of the British Imperial government in London. So most Canadians, as I say, felt comfort in that and said, you know what, we don't want to have to deal with that. That's a whole other level of expense and organization. And if the British Army and Navy is there when we should need them, then that's good enough for us. However, the Boer War of 1899 and a naval race between Britain and Germany reversed Canada's dependency on Britain, who now looked to Canada for support in order to strengthen its world image. What's interesting now is that Great Britain, being the empire that it is, it has colonies all over the world. You may have heard the phrase or refrain, the sun does not set on the British Empire. Right? They had colonies everywhere. And basically what's happening is because they have literally overextended themselves and their lines of communication is getting thinner and thinner the more colonies that they take over throughout the world, now Great Britain is looking to its more mature colonies or autonomous dominions in the case of Canada for support in military ventures overseas. And the Boer War, or the South African War, I believe as it's also called, they're the same thing by the way, the South African War and the Boer War, was the first time that Britain really found itself in a situation where they were confronting an enemy that simply was not easily beatable. So, all right. Now, I do have a lecture dealing with South Africa and apartheid and Nelson Mandela and the history there. I get into quite a bit of detail about the Boer War, so I'll just sort of give you the basics of this war, but also more importantly in the context of why Canada would get involved at all. It began when the British started to move inland in South Africa and encroach on land occupied by the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers. Okay, there's quite a backstory here. Roughly in the early mid 1600s, a lot of Dutch, actually French and German Calvinists left Europe because they were being persecuted for their religion. Calvinism is a branch of Luther's Reformation. The Reformation was the Protestant Reformation. Luther was sort of the centerpiece of that Reformation, and then out of that you end up with a variety of different interpretations, whether it be Presbyterianism, Calvinism. The Anabaptists would have been a strain of the Protestant Reformation, and the Presbyterians as well, the Scottish Calvinists. So it gets a bit confusing, but long and short, predominantly Dutch settlers left the Netherlands to start a new life where they could be left alone to till the land and adhere to the religion of their choice, in this case Calvinism. They end up in the southern tip of South Africa where the climate was beautiful and the agricultural possibilities were excellent. So, you know, basically from the 1600s forward, that area had been inhabited by predominantly First Peoples of the region, Africans indigenous to that area, and Dutch settlers who had developed quite a robust colony. The British get involved in South Africa or begin to see an interest there during the Napoleonic Wars because Britain was afraid that South Africa could fall under the control of the French. And that would destroy their lines of communication with India, because before the Suez Canal, the British would have to travel all the way around Africa and then go cut across to India that way. So South Africa was quite important. So they basically take control of the coastal areas, and there's a bit of a war actually between the Dutch settlers and the British. And the Dutch decide to basically cut and run and move inland and create their own states known as the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Okay, so between 1815 and right up until the events that lead to the Boer War in the late 1890s, these two European colonists kind of lived side by side and did their own thing, but did not necessarily mix. Britain claimed they wanted to protect English rights, but the Boers were suspect as this occurred at the same time when gold and diamonds were discovered in their territory. Okay, here we go. Tell you, in history, whenever you discover gold anywhere, people go crazy. Look at the Yukon, look at the Caribou, look at the California gold rush. I mean, it's just, people go crazy because there's a tremendous opportunity. Well, it's interesting that the British would suddenly say that British subjects that are moving into the regions of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State are being discriminated against by the Boers. And it's interesting that they would make this claim at a time right around when gold and diamonds was being discovered. And it's clear that the British Empire wanted a piece of that. So Britain looked to the colonies for support, and English Canadians gave it to them out of a sense of duty to Britain, but the French did not, as they largely sympathized with the Boers. Now, it's very, very interesting. You have to think about this. The Boers were European descendants who lived next to British colonies who were more powerful than them, and they felt discriminated against by the British. The French could completely identify with the Boers because they saw in their struggle in South Africa the same struggle that they were dealing with back home in Canada. So it was a very difficult thing to get French Canadians excited about supporting Great Britain to suppress these Boer republics or to go to war with them. Other British Canadians said, hey, you know, this is a right war. Most didn't really fully understand what this was really all about. I mean, when Great Britain said, we are being discriminated against in South Africa, we need to stand up for our rights, that's all people needed to hear to get riled up and go and enlist and volunteer, because these were volunteers, by the way, that went to South Africa. And I believe upwards of about 1,400 Canadians were willing to risk their lives voluntarily by going to war in South Africa. So Laurier compromised by equipping and transporting volunteers only, who would become part of the British forces. Sorry, 7,300. I think my 1,200 figure, I was confused there with the Canadians and Spanish Civil War, which I did a lecture recently on that. But yeah, so 7,300 would go to South Africa, volunteers. In Quebec, Henry Bourassa in Quebec rallied against Laurier, suggesting that Canada needs to be more independent from imperialist wars of Britain. You know, Bourassa was kind of right on this one, because we were just buying into this war hook, line, and sinker out of a sense of duty to Great Britain. As I said, we didn't fully understand the real politics behind it. We didn't understand how the Boers were being treated and maybe mistreated in this region. And, you know, maybe we needed to do our own homework. Maybe we needed to ensure that we understood all the complex facts that were relating to this war before we made a decision. And I think Bourassa was kind of right on this one, that look, you know, we can't just jump into this because we want to support the empire. What if they're on the wrong, you know? And certainly, as I said before, French Canadians were not interested in getting involved in this, what appeared to be an imperialist war against the Boers. All right, well, so you had the Boer War that divided English and French Canadians, but then you had something called the naval issue. And remember that Great Britain controlled our navy. So there were people who were beginning to say, you know, maybe we should begin to think about at least maybe not having an army, but at least having our own navy. We do have significant coastal areas on both sides, on the Atlantic and Pacific side of this country, and even up north in the Arctic as well, but that was less of a worry. That maybe it's something we think about. But what really begins to sort of entice this discussion about a navy was events that were occurring in Europe between Britain and Germany. Because Germany began to compete with Britain's navy. Britain launched the first dreadnought in 1906, the first all-big gun battleship with a top speed of 21 knots. These ships were expensive, and Britain looked again to colonies for help. Okay, so now Britain's saying, all right guys, right, we've helped you guys for years, we've looked after you, we've fed you, we've traded with you, we've propped you up, whatever it may be that they think they've done, some of which was certainly true. It's now time for you guys to give back to us. So Britain was basically saying, this is what we need you guys to do. And Britain was predominantly speaking to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the well-developed colonies in the empire. English Canadians wanted to contribute ships or money to Britain, and French Canadians wanted a navy of our own, which could be made available to Britain in times of war. Okay, think about that difference. The English Canadians wanted to contribute money or make ships and give them to Britain, where French Canadians said, why don't we just have our own navy and make them available to Great Britain in times of war and need. But then when that need is over, they come back to Canada. So, you know, has its logic. In 1910, Laurier instituted the Naval Services Act, a plan to build 11 ships to be made available to Britain as needed, and Britain would loan Canada 2 ships until they finished, including the Rainbow for the West Coast, which was stationed in Victoria, BC at Esquimalt, and the Niobe for the East. So basically, Britain was going to loan us 2 ships to tide us over in our defense as we began the process of building our own ships, which would then be made available. I mean, it seems kind of ludicrous when you think about it, 1 ship per coast. So who are we going to stop? How are we going to stop a powerful American Navy if they come up to take British Columbia or Nova Scotia? Or, you know, or the Japanese make their way over? I mean, it seems ludicrous, but I guess it was the gesture that counted. The problem with the Niobe and the Rainbow was that they were out-of-date, decrepit ships, so they were kind of refuse for the British Empire anyway. So, but still, Conservative leader Robert Borden ridiculed the Tin Pot Navy, and the French Canadians feared it still tied Canada too closely to British imperialism. By 1914, Canada still did not have a navy other than the 2 obsolete British warships. So basically, what Canada recognized is that if you want to build ships, steel, powerful ships, you need mature steel industries, which we did not have in Canada at this time. We were not nearly as advanced industrially as Great Britain. Great Britain and Germany were the industrial leaders who had made tremendous advancements in steel and railroad building and so on and so on and so on. We were still just beginning to find our footing in these things, so I think realistically Canada was not in much of a position to be building navies quite yet. That'll come later, but not in 1911. All right, so you have the naval issue, you have the Boer War, and then you have something called reciprocity. Now, reciprocity is just another word for free trade. Free trade has been an ongoing discussion, debate between policymakers in Canada, and particularly between policymakers in Canada, the US, and also Mexico. NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, signed in the middle-late 1980s under the Mulroney administration and Ronald Reagan, has now been renegotiated. It is now called the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada, and this new free trade agreement has been negotiated between the Trudeau administration and the Trump administration, and the Mexican leadership as well. So the issue of free trade is one that crops up all the time, and I really want to be clear in explaining what that means, because people hear those terms and they don't necessarily think about what that means. So during the 1911 elections, Canadians were preoccupied with the idea of free trade. Western farmers were tired of being captive to Eastern manufacturers who could not make farm machinery as cheaply as the US. Okay. Let me explain something to you first. Here's what was happening. Prairie farmers in Canada wanted access to American-made farming machinery because it was cheaper and it was better. The equipment that was being made by Canadian businesses in Quebec and Ontario were much more expensive than American farm equipment, and not nearly as good. So which ones do you think Canadian farmers wanted? They wanted the American machinery. And basically what happens is that when a government wants you to buy Canadian-made stuff, okay, they put on tariffs on import duties. So I'll give you an example. An American tractor, 20 bucks to buy. A Canadian tractor is $25 to buy, okay? Well, Canadians are going to buy the $20 American tractor. However, Canada's government protects Canadian businesses by putting a $7 tax on every American tractor that comes into the Canadian market, making it then $27 to the Canadian consumer, where the Canadian one is $25. Now in that case, most farmers will then be inclined to buy the cheaper Canadian-made product. That's called protectionism. Protectionism is when you have taxes on imports to encourage people to buy Canadian-made products. Okay? Protectionism is not good for the consumer because they end up paying more than what they should, right? So when you talk free trade suggests that you don't have border tariffs, that if the Americans can import tractors up to Canada for 20 bucks a pop, or whatever figure you want to throw out there, that's what Canadians should pay, regardless of where it's manufactured. So obviously, Canadian farmers want free trade. Canadian tractor making companies want protectionism. They want taxes, tariffs at the border, right? Farmers convinced the Liberal government to negotiate a reciprocity treaty, free trade, with the US, thereby reducing tariffs on cheaper US imported goods. You know, let me use another analogy just so you can kind of understand where we're going here. Let's use the Walmart analogy. You know, Walmart gets a lot of criticism for this and that, and, you know, labor issues and working conditions and so forth. But at the end of the day, Walmart's in Canada. Why do Canadians shop there? Because it's less expensive, right? Kids' clothing, groceries is significantly less expensive than going to other local grocers, you know. So when you ask someone, well, we really need to buy local, we need to support our local economy and buy local. In principle, I completely agree with that. But if I can spend, you know, $1 on a loaf of bread at Walmart, where the exact same loaf of bread is $2.25 at a competitor store in town, where am I going to go? It's the same product. You're going to go to the place that has the cheaper bread, Walmart, you know. So, point being is that because we have a free trade agreement, what that means is that American businesses can come to Canada and set up anywhere, and they can price competition, right? But that, at the end of the day, is what is best for consumers, because what consumers want is the best price to feed their families and take care of their children. And as a parent, I'm very much in that camp, you know. And I do support local business when I can, but I also will be careful not to spend twice as much for something when I don't need to. So it's a really interesting conundrum as Canadians to continue to, you know, contribute to our economy, but at the same time ensure that we can afford things too. Business leaders fought free trade, right? Because they don't want you buying American-made stuff. They want you buying their stuff because they feared a loss of business, and railway companies with east to west traffic feared south to north competition. Now think about this. The Canadian Pacific Railway was built across the breadth of this country. If we go from Ontario to British Columbia, it is a straight line right across the prairies, then of course through the Rocky Mountains onto Vancouver, right? All the traffic is flowing either west to east or east to west. If you have got stuff that is being shipped from the States because it's cheaper and better and prairie farmers want to buy, then you're going to have railways going north to south and south to north that are importing cheaper goods to prairie farmers. So in effect, when you have a massive influx of business coming from the States, it is also impacting the economy of the Canadian Pacific Railway, because then it reduces the amount of stuff coming back and forth east to west by increasing the amount of stuff going from north to south. So, Canadian nationalists wanted resources to stay in Canada, and the overarching fear of an American economic takeover saw Laurier lose the 1911 election. Laurier was in an impossible situation. If he puts in a free trade agreement, he's supporting the farmers, but he's infuriated business interests. If he puts in tariffs and follows a pattern of buy Canadian protectionism, you've made business interests happy, but you've infuriated the consumer. So where's the balance, right? I mean, it's very, very complex. But that's kind of where he was at. And it was the issue of reciprocity, free trade, that became the huge debate in 1911 that would actually see him lose the election. So, all right, so from reciprocity to the Alaska boundary dispute. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but I believe the yellow is where the boundary would end up. The blue is what the Americans wanted the boundary to be, and the red is where the Canadians wanted it to be. Now, why is there a difference? Well, if you think of it this way, if you are blue, you control all of the waterways and all of the inlets here, right? So the red kind of says, well, then we will control some of them. quite a number of them, and or in this case, this section here would be controlled by the Americans. So the dispute, or even you see this one here too, so the dispute was, where exactly is this panhandle line going to go? Of course, both want to have some access, if not all access, to the waterways, right? For shipping purposes. So when the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, the remote border between the northwest of BC and Alaska was basically ambiguous, unclear. And no one cared until the discovery of gold in the Yukon in 1898 brought a surge of miners. Here we go again. Gold, gold, gold. Caused problems in South Africa, in the Cariboo in California, and here it is in the Yukon. Hundreds of thousands of people, particularly gold seekers from the States, are coming up, to get to the Yukon's up here. So they're coming up, Seattle, Vancouver Island, and then up this way. So with all these people coming in, well, who controls these areas where all these gold seekers are coming in? I guess we better figure that out, which it had never been clarified fully yet. Getting to the gold fields by easy sea route was only possible by going through American territory, of course. And the dispute would be settled by an international tribunal, and Laurier agreed in 1903 that there would be 3 U.S. judges, 1 British judge, and 2 judges. Okay, right off the bat. If you look at this, okay, because Canada and the U.S. could not reach a consensus, they could not, agree on it. So they said, look, we're going to put this to an international tribunal. 5 out of the 6 were British and Canadian, but 1 was British, right? So what happens, though, if the 3 American judges side and then the 1 British and 2 Canadian judges side? 3 and 3. It's a draw. Then what? Right? But what happens is Britain would side with the Americans on this vote for the boundary to appease them during other disputes in Venezuela, and Canada was outraged, demanding more autonomy over foreign affairs. What the boundary dispute does is it makes Canadians realize that once again we cannot have these kinds of things occur where our fate is in the hands of somebody else, the Americans and the British. And when the British cynically sided with the Americans because they wanted to appease the Americans regarding other border disputes that the British and the Americans had in Venezuela and other parts of the world, it was totally at the expense of Canada. I mean, there's no question that Great Britain was working clearly out of self-interest, and as a result we lost the boundary dispute. So, and what ends up happening is that all the waterways all this becomes American, right? So, the Klondike Gold Rush and the Alaska boundary dispute would encourage the Canadian government to establish the Yukon Territory in 1898, which we do, with Dawson City as its capital. So the frenzy of activity of Americans coming up to the Yukon, which was part of Canadian territory, but it was an undeclared, in name, a territory with its own local administration, is now established. And that is basically just to secure that that is part of Canada and it's not going anywhere. It is now a territory. So. And apparently at one point Dawson City was one of the most dynamic. I mean, it's remarkable with these gold rushes that you get these hundreds of thousands of gold seekers, and Dawson City becomes an incredibly dynamic, lively place. Lots of money, lots of things going on. And when the gold rush is over, everybody leaves. It becomes like a ghost town. I mean, look at Barkerville in British Columbia. It's the same kind of thing. So, the boundary dispute really instigates that. Well, despite all these conflicts, these regional conflicts, these domestic conflicts, overseas conflicts, Canada is really beginning to now find its own voice, and we are also beginning to understand that we have a tremendous amount of natural resources that can be sold overseas on the open market and bring a lot of wealth to this country. Rapid industrial growth in the Western world was creating a high demand for Canadian resources like lumber and minerals. Pulp and paper industries in Canada saw dramatic growth in the newspaper industries, and the Canadian Shield was mined for nickel and copper. At one point in the 1920s, 70% of the paper used in the American newspaper industry was made from Canadian pulp and paper. So, you know, the thing is, it's great to have lots of resources, but what's greater than having lots of resources is having someone to buy them all, you know. And the thing is, once you've satisfied the Canadian market, yet there's still a tremendous amount of resources. Let's use logs. Everyone's built a home out of wood, and now what do you do with the wood, right? Well, you're going to need some kicking around because people are going to continue to build homes. But if you could ship it overseas and sell it in the open market, then you're going to continue to bring in money into the Canadian economy. In BC, lumber and fishing were booming, and the completion of the CPR in 1885, that's the Canadian Pacific Railway, saw a tremendous movement of goods from east to west. In addition, there was a population explosion on the prairies, which propelled the region from the hinterland to the bread basket of Europe, of the world rather. And what we see between 1890 and 1914, and certainly beyond, but this is where that 25-year period we saw a tremendous influx of farmers, of people coming from Eastern Europe. And those who were mostly successful were the ones that were coming not only from places that had a similar climate like the Ukraine, but people that already had skill in agriculture. So that was changing the landscape of our country. This in turn saw growth in manufacturing industries, and Canada's new hydroelectric potential was harnessed to power the new factories and mines. So we're now beginning to tap into the incredible abilities that Canada has in our industries. All right, so that is the first part of our Laurier discussion. The next part is going to deal predominantly with the opening of the West. Who came? What was their experience like? What challenges did they face? And they faced many. And we're also going to be looking at what challenges were faced by other people who came, whether it be the Chinese who came, who were hired by CPR agents to come to Canada and help build the railroad. We're going to look at the challenges faced by South Asians who came from India to Canada as well, and many, many others. So while it's a very dynamic period, there's also sort of new conflict beginning to develop in this country. So that being said, we'll leave it at that, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.